Hi, and welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. This podcast is about the place where design and development overlap. We talk with experts to get their point of view about trends in design, code, and how it relates to the world around us. As always, this podcast is brought to you by Knapsack. Check us out at knapsack.cloud. If you want to get in touch with the show, ask some questions, or generally tell us what you think, go ahead and tweet us at the DS Pod. We'd love to hear from you. Hey everyone, welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Strahl. Today, I'm here with a couple of folks from Spotify, Smith, Schwartz, and Tyce Clee. Smith is the design manager for the Spotify advertising design system, and Tyce, he does engineering management for design systems at Spotify. Welcome to the program. So excited you're both here.
Thank you for having us.
Great to be here.
So Encore is the name of your design system, but it has sort of this interesting relationship between, in particular, the advertising part of the design system and the Encore DS at its core. So why don't you kind of give me a lay of the land for how design systems work inside of your organization?
It's a good question. So the core system itself is made up of our design tokens, decisions, patterns, baseline assets like images, typography, icons. Radiating out from those core things, we have our web and mobile products, and they serve the majority of our customers that are building Spotify experiences in R&D, as we call it, so mobile and web products.
So there's a lot of like core bits there that are representative of the brand. They're representative of some baseline decision making. And then as that goes, there's also a couple of things around tools and other stuff as well. But then that goes out to a team like Smith's. So Smith, how do you then use that Encore team to actually build product?
Yeah, I like to think about it as a yes and relationship. Everything Encore builds, we use, and we build very specific parts and pieces to the ads business. We support an entire business unit, so it's kind of an interesting local system setup. We have a bunch of like data dense web tools. We have like a self-service advertisement tool called Ad Studio. We have a fairly recent acquisition, a podcast publishing platform called Megaphone that's very data dense, lots of data viz, very large enterprise clients using that platform. And then we also support all of the listener-facing ad format UI that you would see in the free experience of Spotify. So we're really spanning everything from web, desktop app, mobile, iOS, Android, refrigerators, cars, TVs, anywhere you can listen to audio.
What I hear when I hear that kind of relationship, right, is it's a yes and thing where you have this Encore DS that is largely the basic bits. And those basic bits are then able to be remixed by your team to support not just one product, but a bunch of different products across that ad ecosystem.
Correct. So sometimes it's like filling in missing pieces, adding in like a web audio player that's different than our consumer audio player, like maybe a smaller audio player that you might need in a more complex UI. And then sometimes it is a variant on something that Encore supports and builds. And so we take that component and we just build that variant. So that one instance that we need in our tooling.
Gotcha. So when you actually produce the Encore DS, what does somebody like Smith get? And Tyce, tell me what that looks like from a consumer's perspective, because you have this central thing that you're building. What's that deliverable look like into Smith's ecosystem?
So for the last few years, we've had this concept of local systems, as Smith mentioned just before. And what we created for these areas of the business that need more than the basics, more than just buttons and form inputs and what we like to call those core components. We created an ecosystem where these teams can use those components and build upon them. And one of the things that we did was not just ship the basics, the components themselves, the guidelines on how to use them, and the Figma toolkits, but we also created an environment where they could sort of live with us and move in with us and then create their variants, as Smith mentioned before, so more complex versions of components or scaffolding them together, but they do it in the Encore ecosystem. So what that means in reality from an engineer's point of view is they're with us in our repository, so they get all of our infrastructure, the way that we deploy our CI/CD setup, our visual regression suite, linting rules, basically all the bits required to create really great components. And then they just need to focus on their components. So that's the kind of pitch from the engineering side of it. And then from the design side, we provide our Figma toolkits that have sort of the same thing. So all the components that, as you mentioned before, local systems can kind of remix and build upon and create their own toolkits. So what we were trying to do was make it easy for local systems to focus on the stuff that makes sense for them and their area of the business, and then provide more than just the components. We wanted to provide more support for them to do that sort of work.
That's really cool. So we have a tendency at Knapsack to think about the things that go into a design system broadly as patterns. And one of the things that is often overlooked is the idea that tooling is also a pattern. Linting rules, like there is no such thing as like a linter that isn't a pattern. It is exactly the way that you want to clean up everything as you move through your code shipping process. Likewise, like CI and scripting, that's all patterns as well. I love that you think about the core of the design system as more than UI, but it's also the things that you need to be able to actually leverage that UI. I think likewise, there's a lot of that in a similar vein in Figma. And Figma actually does a really good job with this in the design sense of trying to bake in a bunch of rules about how to design along with the actual like patterns that are designed and UIs that are designed as parts of that Figma ecosystem. When you guys are receiving that stuff, Smith, how is it that you start to like evaluate what you want, what you need to change, and what you need to build on?
Yeah. First of all, it's kind of a dream to move in with Encore because like they do all the hard stuff that we don't have to do. We don't have to set up a doc site. We don't have to figure out like where our library is going to live. We don't have to answer any of those hard questions that you do when you're first setting up a system because they've already solved a lot of those problems. Really, in a lot of ways, we're dealing with some legacy UIs that have been built without design systems in mind or with older design systems that have been deprecated. So we can look at the delta between what Encore provides and then what those products need, like what they currently have in their UI, what they could need in their UI in the future to support like new features coming down the line. And really, some of the work that I've been very excited about that feels pretty unique to this space in a local system, we work a lot with content design too. And so we think a lot about how to put those pieces together. So all of the Encore parts and pieces and patterns, all of the ads parts and pieces and patterns. And how do you make sense of those as a designer or engineer? So one of our designers, Sarah Stala, has been working on what we've called form hierarchy. So it's really taking all of those form elements that Encore builds and then a handful of things that we build and put them together with a really strict rule set that makes sense on how to build things. And that's something we're starting to get a lot of good feedback from, even from PMs, like folks who don't typically interface with design systems as much, really helping them figure out the surfaces that they're trying to design.
Gotcha. So in that case, presumably there are form fields in Encore. And then what you all are doing is you all are trying to build a new pattern on top of that leverages that Encore pattern that then has the hierarchy system structured in it. Because like form hierarchy is a pain in the butt. Like everybody, solves this problem 400 different ways. Like forms are one of the most difficult things you can do on the web. It's sort of like a problem akin to calendaring. Like it seems much more simple than it actually is.
Right. And then when you've got a bunch of designers working in one singular form flow, like that flow can vary pretty wildly from like component to component and why and how they're using it. One of our products had instances where they had, 5 or 6 different versions of radio buttons. So it was really like trying to simplify, pull out the stuff that we don't need anymore, center on Encore's version and then see like what's missing from the suite, like really trying to understand what problems designers are trying to solve by that radio button abuse. Like how can we create some better components that solve the problems in a more elegant way so that they have a larger tool set.
I just like see a designer in the corner like itching themselves saying, you got any more radio buttons?
It's probably good to note on that point, Chris, that what Smith is talking about there is one of the guiding principles behind why we have attempted local systems. So it's like a two-way street. We want to provide all this infrastructure and support, documentation, tooling, everything that you need to go and create these patterns. But then the hope and the very intention behind that is that teams like Smith's can test new patterns in the wild and get immediate feedback as to whether they're actually working with the end customer, the end user, because we don't directly work with anyone that actually uses a Spotify product. We work with and partner with teams that go and build the experiences that people will go and use. So that feedback loop is really important for us because we've had scenarios where local systems have built a new pattern or something new where they've taken our base components and done something new with it. And then we've discovered that that pattern is useful in other parts of the business. So that's our biggest leading indicator is the moving that component or pattern or whatever that thing is up into the core system. It could also just be documentation. We sort of value design, documentation, and code equally. So in a way, we think it's a really novel way to help parts of the business that need all that stuff, as Smith mentioned, and don't have the time to create all that and do it in like a really holistic and smart way. But then it does ultimately benefit the entire company if that pattern is something that other people want to use. And then we would promote it to the core system, sort of take it off a team like Smith's hands and say, we're going to own this now with your permission. So that's less that they need to own. And then all of their good work gets surfaced across the entire company. So it's almost like a springboard for a pattern that has been proven to be successful. And then we become the delivery mechanism for the rest of the company.
It's a really powerful story for innovation sharing. I've often talked about how when I think about the value of design systems, people tend to think about like the faster, cheaper story and not as much of the better story, right? And so when you think about like what it takes to build better software, having that federated sort of system view where you're really, really, really user and consumer centric, right? Like extremely so, where the last mile of most patterns is actually being built or forged in the fires of actual users. And then that gets contributed back up into the system. And then anybody can take advantage of that thing that is like hardened and tested and very, very user-centric across the organization. So it's, form hierarchy, right? Like, hey, we went and solved this problem and we spent a bunch of time and a bunch of effort going and solving form hierarchy. Everybody should be able to take advantage of that and use that form hierarchy to build better software. And I think there's dozens of examples of this in most design systems that have this federated model, where you look very deeply at, I created a bunch of innovation in this particular pattern. Now I can bring that pattern all across the organization and build better software as a result.
The thing that we're trying to do a little differently, just to build on that, is by inviting these local systems into our ecosystem, we're priming them for that transition of ownership to be much faster because they're already building with our standards in mind. And we've seen that that's been really, really successful. I would say a lot of the requests lately for Encore things, which is our design system with Spotify, haven't been for components, but we've had a lot of requests for like, how do we build a really great component? Like, how do we do this? Like, this is what you do every day. So tell us how we can do this better. So we're finding that our guidelines and things like we mentioned before, things like linting and all those little bits that help you, quote unquote, do the right thing, create and maintain quality. We're finding more and more in 2022 that people are wanting that when they're building feature level components and patterns. And that just sort of reiterates why the design system of Spotify is more than just the code and design. In fact, it's very equally weighted with all that other stuff that helps people build quality things.
That's actually really interesting. Do you feel that as a function of maturity in your design system where people understand what contribution means? And I mean, immediately, like you're looking for like, what the heck is a component? How do I use this thing? Like, how do I absorb this central system and sort of make it my own? And now, does it feel like people are maybe turning that corner into, okay, I now understand this. Now let me understand how I can take it to the next level or build something new and interesting and then contribute that back?
Yeah. And I think that all kind of comes back to our embedded model. And so folks really all around Spotify, I know Tyce has been a huge champion of this program, is you can go and embed on projects for a certain amount of time. And that's what we've used to staff our design system for this first iteration and really lay the foundation, especially from an engineering perspective. And one of the requirements we have for our engineers is that they go and they embed with the Encore team for a certain period of time before they come back and actually even do any hands-on keyboards work with our components, because we want to make sure that we're building to the same standards, that we have the same level of accessibility, compliance, localization, that these components are really tried and true and tested and super durable. And that's been a super important part as to how we've been able to do what we can do because Encore exists.
So you guys have a tremendous amount of investment in this system. You have a central system, you have local systems, you have a rotation, you have an embed culture, you promote and contribute people sort of all around the organization and the patterns that they build. Talk to me a little bit about the strategic alignment of the design system inside of the organization, right? Obviously, you view this as a strategic asset because investment has not been a one-time thing for you all. It's ongoing. There's a bunch of folks in both design and engineering and in product that are all working within this system and learning more about it. Talk to me about how that relates to business value for a second.
Yeah, advertising, particularly at Spotify, has undergone a huge wave of growth, especially in the past year or so. And so, since we've scaled our team to be quite large, that, comes with a lot of problems in organizational culture. And we really think, or I really think, that design systems is a way to kind of harness that and to make sure that folks are delivering with the same level of quality and consistency. I think that will turn into great outcomes for the customers as well, because folks who maybe start out on one platform, if you're an advertiser building an ad in our self-serve tool, but then you start to get, larger and you want to move into more of a direct sales venue, you're not relearning patterns, you're not relearning how to use the tooling. It all feels the same, and kind of the same on the consumer experience as well. Like, those should feel more native and more integrated to that Spotify listening experience and not pulling you out of your listening journey that you're on.
Gotcha. So you have a way then of thinking about it from again, like a very customer-centric point of view, where you're thinking about the design systems as a strategic way of continuing to engage your customers, not just about like the overall structure of advertising inside of Spotify. That is a part of it. But a big part of this is about thinking about like what that engagement looks like at multiple points in a listener's journey across multiple devices, across all the different platforms that you all service.
Right, right. And it's easy for teams to fall into that siloed trap of just kind of working in an insular way. And since we span across the entire BU, we work with all of the different teams and really see ourselves as the glue holding together a lot of the work that's going on. And we can, from this purview, we can see a lot of the work that's happening in different arenas and help drive that consistency and drive that collaboration where folks might not know that duplicative things are happening across the business.
It's really fascinating because you have a central design systems team, you have a central ad team that is leveraging a local system of that design system, and then presumably you have product teams as well. So this is actually a relatively complex architecture. Tyce, like what other sorts of consumption models exist for Encore that you've seen?
It's a good question. I can actually remember a diagram that Smith put together that really articulates what you just said then, where we have the core system and some people will pull directly from that system, and then we might have local systems that maybe have a little bit less rigidity around the rules, but still mostly influenced by Encore and our set of rules and guidelines. And then I remember in that diagram, Smith, you'd have product teams who are sort of informed by the guidelines and the rules that came before them, but it's looser again. So that model of like, maybe we do have stronger guidelines and restrictions in the core. I think that's responsible. But then as you emanate away from that, that turns into more of like guidelines to help those product teams build that stuff. So that diagram has helped me kind of think about how that looks out there, like in the rest of R&D teams.
So how are you thinking about decision making when you look at that kind of complexity? And this is this is the standard things that we all think about when we think about the structure of design systems, right? And again, Anna Kolmatova's design system book is literary canon at this point about the different spectrums that we all think about. How strict do you make adherence to a component inside of Encore? How integrated are those components? Like, are they opinionated or are they not? And how modular do you look to build those things? Like, where would you fall on that spectrum?
I wrote a ticket today after a recent inventory from the team on the library that was about better defining when we want to be opinionated and when we're not. I would say that we aren't really there yet when it comes to having a good, strong opinion on when to be opinionated. That's very meta to say that in a sentence, but
design systems, we live in the meta.
It's just a cyclical meta thing. Yeah. I would say that that's an area of opportunity for the next 6 to 12 months. And we're going to be leaning heavily on our local systems to help us inform that. But the idea is that we will be able to get to a place where we can say pretty emphatically in a document, this is the level of opinions that we want to have at the core system. And we're not really going to stray either side of that. Right now, we kind of have what a lot of design systems are pretty familiar with, which is like a mixture of both opinionated and not opinionated components. And I like to think of that as digital archaeology because I've been working on this system both as an engineer and an engineering manager for almost 5 years. I'm a culprit in that, but you can sift the layers of sand back on this system and you can see, I can point to, we've had 9 majors, no more than that, probably like close to 10 or 11 majors of the web system so far with 2 different names. And I can point to probably each major and tell you how far the pendulum swung from folk wanting really opinionated kind of kitchen sink, stateful, baked in components to just plug and play. And then when the pendulum swang back in a certain year and a certain month and people were like, no, we want the single pattern. We want one component is one element. Give us all the Lego and we'll figure it out. Where we've landed now, it's neither. I think there's somewhere in the middle, and we're hearing a chorus now of people saying something like what Smith said to me the other day. It was a great quote, Smith. I wrote it down, and you said something to the effect of, we in ads, we don't want to build a button. We just want to be able to tell our customers how to use the button. And I thought that was pretty much where we're getting to at Spotify, is the desire for folk to reinvent an HTML button has dissipated. And instead, people are like, we just want to kind of grab and go with these things, but we have a level of expectations. We expect that it's accessible. We expect that it can be localized in any string. We expect that it'll operate in any device or viewport that we put it in. We expect this stuff, so do that. And we're like, that makes sense. So that's kind of our mission moving forward from here, is how can we create that baseline for our components, fix the stuff that doesn't adhere to that, and then anything we build moving forward, we want to probably center around that level of complexity and that level of opinion, which is different. It's just over the years, we've kind of shifted really dramatically. I would say, though, that as we've become more fully staffed and product entered the field, things got a lot better when it came to like trying to figure out what that looks like and how to make decisions that would felt a bit more holistic.
So how did product really change that mindset?
Changed the game entirely, I would say. Having some product people working on Encore brought a whole different lens, because I think designers and engineers, we can make and ship just about anything. And I think a lot of these tech companies recruit the best in the business. Having product in the room, though, finally someone was saying, but why? What is this enabling? Like, who is this helping? Like, how do we learn to say no? And I think those things have really helped Encore sort of get less sporadic with who we're helping and when and why, choosing breadth over depth. Do we try and build something that helps 400 applications, or do we try to focus on the 5 that are most important to the business? Those decisions are really driven by product. So I'm a massive product fanboy when it comes to design systems, because it's not about can you build it, but it's like, should you? And what if it's like a startup where every decision you make, you want to do this, and that means you can't do 5 other things. So I'd say product is something I wish we had a little sooner in the journey, to be fair.
I feel that very acutely.
I thought you might, Chris.
Talking about a startup that lives in the meta. I mean, so we have a design system for a design systems platform.
Wow.
That's a meta sentence right there.
Yeah. That also, we build demos of design systems on that design systems platform.
You're essentially like filming Inception 2, right? Where you just don't know how deep are we, Chris? There's the spinning top falling over, no one knows.
Exactly. I mean, you can get lost in it really easily. It is interesting, though, that we've sort of landed in a similar place to you all, where if you think about what needs to be built, right? Like, we'll have a button pattern, and that button pattern will have like touch controls predefined for it, accessibility predefined for it. But the implementation of that button has to be pretty fluid for us, because stuff changes in our application so quickly. I mean, yeah, we're a small team, but the whole point of being a startup company is that you can move your software product really, really quickly in a direction. And so we have to have that agility and that maintained inside of our system. And it's honestly been a pretty continual struggle about, which of the spinning tops are we knocking over today? Because it's very difficult to continue to maintain that agility and implementation while still having that consistency at that higher level. And it gets really confusing. At what level am I using my design system today is kind of a thing that we face daily. So, Smith, when you think about product and the engagement of product in the design system, how is that specifically related to the ad localization? Like, do you all have product people as well that are different than the core Encore folks? Or is it sort of like shared? How do you think about that product influence then at that local level?
Yeah, so we work directly with the product folks on the feature teams. And I do think that we do a good job of prioritizing, like, as a BU, like, what are the top 10 things we're working on, so that we know, okay, which designers to reach out to, what can we build to support that work, what are the foundational aspects of that work that we could take off of their plate so that they could run a little more quickly.
So there is definitely like a product-centric viewpoint at that high level, and then at the actual feature team level. And so that's basically helping you evaluate what goes into your local system relative to Encore.
Correct, yeah.
So one of the things that I love most about this is it's really designed with contribution and extension in mind. And how did you all arrive at this? Who is the mastermind behind this systems concept? Because this works really well for you, obviously. It seems well adopted. as I mentioned before, you guys continue to invest huge amounts of time and resources into this. Obviously, the business sees a ton of strategic value here. So who was it that was sitting there saying like, you know what, we need to build it like this? Or was it much more organic than that? Like, can you give me a sense of the decision pathways that led you to this point?
We were actually just chatting about this the other day. Like, when did local systems sort of become a thing? How do they evolve over time? And I think it's a good story because there's a story of caution in here. There's like a word of warning to some degree, because some of your listeners might be thinking, this is great, we should spin this up immediately. We've actually talked to some of our peers in the industry that were like, let's do it. And I was like, wait, just wait. Please let me tell you this story, and I'll be brief. But when we pitched the concept of local systems for Encore back in probably late 2019 when we launched the design system, what we did then is not what we're doing now. We said, we will extend the brand of Encore to you. We will try to help you as best we can. Go forth. Tell us what you make. Just use the name Encore in there somewhere, and then we'll sort of like hold your hand and see what we can do to assist. So no infrastructure support, very minimal toolkit support. The website and the documentation was there, but it was sort of fractured compared to where we're at today. What happened is a couple of systems sprung up pretty quickly, which was great. And they were serving their purpose to some degree. They were helping business units or product areas in the business kind of move a little faster, and they had their own brand and their own sort of interpretation of the components. But then what we found is, particularly on the engineering side, is there was none of that support that we have now. So there was no help to say, hey, we want to write it in this way. This is a sort of the bare minimum standard of code quality we expect to be in these components. And to some degree, that started to hurt our brand because people were seeing Encore something, associating that with the core system, but then seeing a discrepancy in like, oh, this exists in code, but it's not in Figma, or it's documented and it's in Figma, but it's not in code. So we wrote a request for comment, an RFC, to say, let's have them move in. Let's just go all in. I was saying to Smith the other day, I used the analogy of living alone and all the benefits that come with that. and then saying, I think for us to succeed and grow, we want to get a bigger place, but to get a bigger place, we need to have some housemates. And I've used that analogy to death now around what that means. When new people living with you bring a few tricky things, you need to adjust some of your rituals and processes and routines. You need to know that there's more than one person paying for the bills or whatever, what have you. But a lot of the benefits that come from that too around new ideas and challenging things that you've done before. So that's what we did. So we're sort of in phase 2 of local systems, where we went out to the ones that existed on their own. Some of them didn't make it. Some of them actually spun down, which I think is a success story. They were no longer needed in that part of the business, so they spun down. But then another couple moved in with us. And then the most recent one is Smith's team from ads, where they saw what we were trying to do. And I think we offered a lot of support, and they needed that at that time. But now they've been really helpful for evolving the concept of local systems, showing us what can be done when you're in a certain part of the business, and then feeding back to us how we should be evolving some of our practices and guidelines.
That's wonderful. I love the story about culling things, in particular from a design system. And I actually view that as a mark of maturity in a DS team, when you actually are able to do the pruning. Because everybody is always trying to say, like, give me more content, give me more stuff, put more things in it. And then the moment you get to say, like, wait a second, like, do we actually need this anymore? You've kind of reached a different plateau. And, you know, the ability to gracefully let something go, I think, is kind of beautiful in the design systems landscape. So, Smith, for you, like, what was it like to move into the house, if you will? Like, you know, I think that
I'm excited to hear this. I haven't heard this unfiltered yet, so let me get the popcorn. I love it,
right? So, you know, like, if you live alone, like, yeah, you don't do the dishes one night, no big deal. You're the only one that has to deal with it, right?
No one will know.
Right.
But, you know, were there dirty dishes all over the place, or was it pretty well kept?
No dishes, thankfully.
Oh, no,
it was an interesting process, though. I joined Spotify a little over a year ago, and I joined on one of the feature teams to work on their instance of the local design system. And I think Tyce was mentioning a lot of these diagrams I was drawing, because I was like, wait, what's the deal here? Like, where does everybody sit? What does everybody do? Like, we have Encore, but then there's the system over here. You know, like, what state is that system in? What are all the components? And, you know, that product was undergoing a pretty large scale migration to kind of do a lot of cleanup on the front end. And so there was just a lot of digging in and learning, like, what had already been done, where were we trying to go. That team was in the process of setting up their repo next to Encore in that same house. But then as I was looking around to the rest of my team across ads, well, why would just this one product get to benefit from all of this Encore goodness? And so that's when we really started pressing on that idea. We had a few recent acquisitions in that place, like that had pretty similar UIs. Like, why couldn't they get the benefit of what we were doing? There were duplicative work streams happening across teams where people were like debating on what a tooltip is. And I'm like, Encore has a tooltip. Why are we talking about this? And so just really like trying to understand organizationally why that was happening. And so some of the leaders in our space decided to pitch this as what Spotify calls a company bet, which is an interesting way of prioritizing these kind of one-off projects on things that we think are going to make a big business impact. And so essentially what that means is you're now like that priority one on everybody's list, and I can come in and ask for resources from different departments and put together a temporary.
You show up on some ops dashboard somewhere is like
exactly.
Yeah,
there's a lot of reporting involved. There's a lot of, crossing your T's and dotting your I's. But it was a really interesting process. And I will say, like, personally, like the relationship I was concerned about the most of starting this was that Encore relationship. And I was a little bit concerned, like, oh, are they going to think that we're trying to say we can do it better than you, or reinventing the wheel, or taking away some of the work that had already happened? So I wanted to be really mindful.
That's really common trepidation, though. Like when people are first entering a system and there's a bunch of system stuff already in place, you're like, well, is this going to be confining or is this going to be empowering? And that's a really difficult, like, mental hurdle to try to, first of all, understand that organization. Like, where are all the bedrooms in the house, right?
Right.
Well, the analogy is great.
Yeah, it's great.
You can go a long way with it.
Right. And I think that's a typical like design system problem. Like a current design system isn't maybe serving your team any longer. And a lot of folks want to just throw that away and start over. And so I didn't want to do that, but like, how can we all work together to make this better? And I have to say, like, personally, I've been very blown away by Tyce and everyone on the Encore team of just being like super game to say like, oh, this is a weird idea. Let's go figure it out together. And like, oh, well, we tried that 3 years ago and here's what happened. Like, and so really leaning on, all of their organizational knowledge and all of the history that they all had with the system and all of the different like processes they had tried in the past and things that worked, things that didn't. We really just got to like stand on their shoulders. And that was like key to making this whole thing work. If we were starting from scratch and trying to reinvent the wheel, we wouldn't get very far.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things before the show that you said that was like most impactful from this conversation was the idea that your business unit could not have done this yourselves. And so because of that, like being able to stand on those shoulders, being able to leverage that system that was existing before and all that organizational knowledge. And by the way, I love the archaeology thing as well. There's so many like metaphors I'm stealing from this podcast. But the whole idea that like extension is by design. And because extension is by design, you were able to do things that you would not have been able to do had Encore not existed.
Right. And we were able to support really a BU that wasn't supported by Encore fully in the way that it needed to be in order for those folks to run fast like they need to.
I wrote something down that we talked about the other day, Smith, where what we're trying to do with local systems is enable them, not restrict them. So we actually want to create an environment where local systems can take more risk. Because to be honest, the closer you get to the core of Encore, we want to take less risk because the responsibility is greater and the damage we can do is much greater if something goes wrong. To be frank, so we had this beautiful model of like the core and then the next ring being the web and mobile products and then the third ring being local systems. And I can give you an example of why local systems have given us more than we could ever imagine is I remember Smith presented a diagram after she did the research to be like, what does this actually look like? Because we had this beautiful crisp, like it looked good, and then Smith created a diagram.
Real proud of that slide.
Oh, I was. And then Smith kind of showed her, she's like, hey, that's great. But respectfully, this is what it actually looks like. And it's kind of like she pulled the layer back and I heard like, gasps in the call, and after that I went to a leads meeting and then someone in the meeting was like, is that what it's actually like? Because what Smith showed us was the actual state of not just local systems, but people pulling on Encore across multiple platforms. And if you can imagine in your mind's eye, instead of a few beautiful little like a quarter of an onion or a sun model, with a few well-placed circles. Instead, it was many circles with dashed lines crossing borders, and it was just like chaos. And I'm like, is that what it's like? It's just like, yep.
I tried to make it as beautiful
It
as
still
possible,
looked beautiful. It still looked designed because Smith is a designer at her core. But that's what I'm trying to say is like, this is why I think this model, this concept, although it needs to be adapted for your company and your needs, and we can talk more about that, about like, when does this make sense? I would say though, the gifts just keep on coming and they'll come in a way that you least expect. So we did not expect that Smith would bring us a diagram that made our jaws drop and go, okay, we need to take a minute. Like, what is happening out there? We were blissfully unaware. We were, working on our core things. We thought, so we went, there's nothing wrong there. It's just having that heartbeat from further out in the business is indispensable. But we didn't know that until groups like Smith's were showing us things like, you're closer to the forefront. You're closer to the customers. You're actually out there on the front lines. We are not. So whatever you do in your company when it comes to this model, if you want to employ it, there is going to be an angle of this that will bring you closer to the customer, but without actually being the one to build for the customer. And I didn't really anticipate how much that's going to help us now and in future.
There is something to the adage of like, you're building a product that serves other products. And that is awkward in some ways, right? Because you're setting up blueprints for somebody that ultimately is serving customers downstream of you. That meta, again, is somewhat difficult to do the mental leap around. And in some ways, like, how you serve your local systems, your local system is your consumer. And then the local systems consumer is the customer. And that sort of daisy chain of responsibility is an interesting mental model for how you think about design system value.
Yeah, and this has got me thinking, Tyce, we've got a new thing that you don't know about yet that I think you're going to be excited to see.
Wow, Smith.
Yeah. Breaking news.
Chris gets the scoop. I see how this is.
I love this.
Cool.
No, but we've got an amazing user researcher team that we work with in ads. And something that we've been brainstorming with them about recently is how do we research at the component level? It's really hard to do a research project on a button or an upload or a very tiny piece of UI. And so our research projects are typically based around features and, those bigger concepts. So what they have started is a dashboard of pulling out very specific, like when they get, users giving them very specific pointed feedback around UI or around components or interactions, we're starting to put that all in a repository so that we can look at that holistically as we're designing and as we're building the next generation of things. And so it's going to be a nice mix of our stuff and Encore stuff kind of all together.
And I think we've talked in the past about how you can get some stuff for free, this concept of like local systems providing stuff for free. It's not really for free. Like, it does take extra effort. This is the word of warning to those that are thinking about this. Like, it does take a lot of extra effort to build and maintain a bigger household. It does. And there's a lot of faith and trust in that too. But then the example Smith just used then, that's the stuff where like we couldn't effectively do that even if we wanted to, because we don't own and maintain products that people touch every day to engage with Spotify. We don't, but we provide them. So another analogy there is like someone that creates a product like flour, like a bag of flour, that then sits on a shelf in a store and may or may not sell. The people that create the flour, they need that feedback from the store as to like, are customers buying it? Do they like it? And that's what I think we've sort of created here with the local systems is like, it's not just a buffer, it's like a real finger on the pulse for how customers are or are not engaging with the things that we build. It's helping us make better decisions. That's another thing that we are investing heavily in is analytics and data around like what's being used, how often are people upgrading? Can we form any hypotheses around major releases that are really difficult to upgrade versus the ones that are easy? And can that help us better shape the future of our releases? So data is really important, but getting that data straight from local systems, it's invaluable.
I love the story of going from, skeptical potential roommate to like trust and codependence, like in the best possible way, right? I think that's one of the brilliant things about this whole conversation and what it's shown me is that you all were able to engender trust in one another and between those systems, like really create something that was better than the sum of its parts. And that's the most interesting kind of story that we have on this show is when people are able to come together, have an understanding that they're all building towards a common goal, and then be able to leverage the parts of the system in a way that both are making the system better. We have a customer, Tommy at Rumbix, that's been on our webinars before. And one of the things that he said that I absolutely love is he says the best part about design systems is in our organization, everybody can leave it better than they found it. And I think that you all really live that model in the ability to focus on contribution, the ability to extend, and by design, set it up so that people can modify and change and edit the system however they need to best serve a customer. And that's super cool.
Yeah, and kudos to Encore for that flexibility for us. I mean, I don't know that we would be able to use all of the Encore things and maintain the level of specificity and guidance that we've been able to provide our teams if that wasn't there.
So this has been a wonderful journey. I love the metaphors. I've learned a lot. Thank you all so much for being on. This is a really cool story, and I'd love to have you back sometime and chat more.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us. Definitely check in 12 or 24 months, see how we're doing.
Sounds great. You all have a great day. That's all for today. This has been another episode of the Design Systems Podcast. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions or a topic you'd like to know more about, find us on Twitter at the DS Pod. We'd love to hear from you with show ideas, recommendations, questions, or comments. As always, this pod is brought to you by Knapsack. You can check us out at knapsack.cloud. Have a great day.